We now come to a part of the program that I'm personally very excited about because we'll be hearing from one of the most prominent early thought leaders on connectivity, Dr. Parag Khanna, the author of many seminal books. But the two that are probably most pertinent for the purpose of today's forum are Connectography, Mapping the Future of Global Civilization, and his most recent book, The Future is Asian, Commerce, Conflict, and Culture in the 21st Century. Before I give him the floor, please allow me to say a few words about Dr. Khanna. He is a truly global citizen, born in India, raised in the United Arab Emirates, the United States, and Germany. He holds degrees from Georgetown School of Foreign Service and a PhD from the London School of Economics. He literally traveled all corners of the world, more than 150 countries in total, and served as the senior geopolitical advisor to the US Special Forces deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's a best-selling author, and he's truly a next-generation leading global strategic thinker. And I know that he deeply cares about Europe and Asia and the ties between them. Dr. Khanna was therefore the perfect person to introduce the subject of connectivity in a special presentation that will very much set the scene for the discussions at today's forum. Now, he just stepped off the plane from Singapore, and I think he deserves a thundering round of applause.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you so much, Anne, for that very generous introduction. I think it's all of you who deserve the applause and the congratulations, and I do want to congratulate the Honorable President of the European Commission, Mr. Juncker, the Honorable Prime Minister of Japan, Mr. Abe, for the milestone that is being marked and celebrated today. And I know that all of you agree with the sentiment that so much has been done and so much is left to be done. And so I want to reflect on both dimensions of time, that which we have achieved thus far and that which is left to go today. Now, the theme, of course, of the rest of your sessions today merits 15 hours of discussion. My role is only 15 minutes, so I'll be brief, but I do want to begin with a basic geography lesson, and that is that every day we should regret the fact that those of you in this room who have children, or all of you fellow Europeans who have children, go to school and they are taught that Europe and Asia are continents. We tell our children this all the time, that they are different continents. But of course they're not, right? They're two different regions of the same continent known as Eurasia. And with each passing year, the power of connectivity brings these two regions closer and closer together. I noted during the Prime Minister's speech that he used the word connectivity quite a few times in English. And this is the irony of this word. It is so powerful, so important, so central to what we are doing between Europe and Asia, what we do when we build infrastructure all over the world, and yet we don't have a word for it in many, many languages. We need to perhaps change that as well. Now, this is a very seminal year for us to be having this conversation, to be gathering, and to measure how far we've come in recent decades. Because, of course, this year marks the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Shortly thereafter, 1991, was the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think many of us may remember the debates from the 1990s, widening or deepening. And the correct answer was, and remains, both. The strength that Europe has today is precisely because it did not succumb to false choices. But we know that we cannot be complacent. When I was a high school student in Germany in the mid-1990s, Euro 2020 conferences drew vast throngs of youth participation. It seemed a foregone conclusion that millennials would become loyal Europeans. And here we are at the doorstep of that 2020. The model EU period is over. It's the real thing. The question is, have we achieved that vision? When I look back at the last 25 years since that high school idealism and euphoria, I wonder where it's all gone. Have we slipped back towards nationalism over supranationalism? It's a reminder of the axiom that there is no Europe, only Europeanization. It's a process, not a destination. Europe has integrated energy grids, as you see here, financial networks and regulatory systems, but a very long way to go on immigration policy, foreign policy, and other areas. So the process of Europeanization is never complete, either internally or externally. And the lesson is that lesson is core to what it means to be an empire, a commonwealth, a superpower, whatever term we want to use to describe Europe and the EU today. You have to balance your internal priorities and your international agendas simultaneously. There is no either or for a great power. It is both and. But the past 3 decades of widening and deepening through infrastructure and institutions, investment and reforms, have made the EU the standard setter for financing connectivity and embedding it. But while Europe was expanding east, Asia was also expanding west. Witness the enormous scale of infrastructure projects associated with the Belt and Road Initiative. Highways and railways, pipelines, electricity grids, fiber optic internet cables. The story actually begins with the leadership of Japan, the Asian Development Bank, and also, crucially, though some may not appreciate it, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, that helped to pave the way for what has now been augmented by the industrial and financial heft of China. And along the way, Asians have made huge strides in achieving positive interdependence. Asia now represents 50% of global GDP in purchasing power parity terms. Here you see the trade networks linking Asian countries, and 60% of Asian trade is between Asian countries. So it's second only to Europe in terms of regional integration. Of course, Asia will never have supranationalism. There will be no Asian parliament, there will be no Asian commission, no common Asian currency, certainly no common Asian army. There will be no Asian union. However, they are deepening their diplomatic coordination through trade networks such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. You can see the growing membership on the right as that agreement comes into effect. And on the left in that Venn diagram, the membership of the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. Now, for those of you who are students of global governance, in the 90s and 2000s, we always measured global governance and others' participation in it by to what degree are they integrating themselves and adapting to our organizations from the West. But what you see when you look at the membership of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the Belt and Road Initiative is that now it is Europeans who are joining an Asian institution. But let's not measure Asia against Europe. Let's understand Asia on its own terms. And here, I think, for everyone in this room and beyond, a bit of historical knowledge and education is required. Asia is by far the most ethnically diverse region of the planet, featuring nearly a dozen major civilizational groups from Indian and Japanese and Chinese, Turkic, Arabic, Persian, Korean. Many empires have expanded and contracted over thousands of years across the vast Asian landscape. None have dominated the full expanse of Asia, except for, you might say, the Mongols 8 centuries ago, but none for too long. Therefore, it is very, very dangerous to do what we have all too frequently slipped into today, which is to view Asia only through the prism of China. Because that not only betrays history, it also sets up a very dangerous self-fulfilling prophecy. And cooperation between Europe and Japan, such as what you are marking today, is a step towards making sure that that doesn't happen. Right now, you are probably well served to be alarmed. The EU has taken its foot off the pedal, you might say, since 2008. You all know the adage, power abhors a vacuum. Here's my modern twist on it. Competitive connectivity is the geopolitics of the 21st century. If you do not nurture connectivity with your neighbors, they will connect more in the other direction. Let's take some examples of that. I want to ask you all a question when I said that Europe has taken its foot off the pedal since 2008. I want to ask you, what do you think Southern European and Balkan countries would do as the funds that supported their modernization slowed down? If you were Italy or Greece at the time, wouldn't you have joined, or would you not be joining, the Belt and Road Initiative as well? Chinese investment in the port of Piraeus has been good for Greece. A similar investment in the port of Trieste in Italy will help Italy become more connected, not only intermodally into Central and Eastern Europe, but of course to boost its exports to the East. So it's time to end the internal ruptures and fissures where we are ostracizing fellow European countries for the efforts that they're making to be globally connected. Especially because it's not too late to view them not as defectors to China, but as bridges to Asia. Now, there are other countries that are the natural bridges to Asia that you might say the EU has lost or been losing or were lost to the EU more than a decade ago, Russia and Turkey. Looking at their infrastructure investment, trade patterns, and political alignments, they are now leaning more east than west. That is why, in the case of Russia, I agree with recent efforts to craft a strategy of collaboration around regional infrastructure in the Arctic to find common ground to build on with Russia moving forward. The same must also be done with Turkey, given how important it is as a gateway to the Caucasus, as a conduit of energy, and as a buffer to Arab instability. You have to do more, of course, than the US policy, which uses sanctions as a substitute for real strategy. That certainly applies to Iran. 40 years of sanctions have proven that change comes much more from engagement than from attempted isolation, or at least that isolation doesn't really work. It certainly won't in the years ahead. As you may know, China and Iran have just signed a 25-year master plan to deepen their ties. So the EU is right to engage with Iran, both commercially and diplomatically. Again, the alternative is you must recognize that competitive connectivity is the necessary strategy for a world where isolation simply does not work. The further you look to the east, the more some of you may not even recognize some of your former colonies. They are now much more populous, have larger economies, faster internet speeds, I might also add, than some countries in Europe. Here you see the global economic distribution in purchasing power parity terms. And the more Asian markets grow, the more they are also catering to themselves, to some degree even decoupling from the West. One example of that is the Southeast Asian region. It's the post-colonial region that ranks just behind the EU in terms of building a new collective model of governance. It has 700 million people right here on this map. That's a larger population, of course, than the EU. But with less than half the population of either China or India, it has a larger GDP than India does and receives now more annual foreign investment than China. Now, Asia is much, much larger than Europe, therefore, and has to be understood in terms of all of these distinct sub-regions. But for an EU strategy to be meaningful, it has to engage with all of those sub-regions within Asia at the same time. Here's the good news. Europe's overall trade with Asia is already much larger than your trade with North America. It's already about $1.6 trillion, and that's just in goods per year, versus only $1.1 trillion across the Atlantic. So, and especially because the US has pulled back from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement with Asia, and of course the TTIP with Europe has not been moving forward, the EU now has pushed ahead with a free trade agreement with Japan and is launching discussions with the Southeast Asian countries of ASEAN, with India as well, to deepen trade with them, as well as bilaterally and multilaterally pushing China to open its markets further. These measures, together with trade along these new Silk Roads, will raise this figure of $1.6 trillion well above $2 trillion, perhaps even to $3 trillion soon. So even as children of transatlantic relations, as many of us are, we do have to update our mental frames. The great structural shift of the post-Cold War era is the transition from a transatlantic to a Eurasian world. That means, of course, that the EU cannot just wait for the US and China, a so-called G2, to make the rules for global trade and global governance, when the EU, in fact, has a far greater stake in that future order. Let's delve a bit deeper into the elements of a full EU-Asia connectivity strategy, a platform of Eurasian understanding that is inclusive and progressive. What does it mean in practice? How would you actually do it? Certainly the key pillars would have to be engagement, transparency, and reciprocity. Let me share some lessons from diplomacy with China in Asia that will help you understand how that plays out. Because reciprocity is a fundamental principle of diplomacy. It is something that in history must be demanded. It is something that can also be conditioned. And Asians that have millennia of history dealing with each other and with China are not waiting for Europe to figure this out. I think it's worthwhile to take a step back and observe how Asians are dealing with these matters, and that can serve as a useful guide. Let me give a few examples of how countries are watching each other and learning. It's not an accident that when one country, such as Malaysia, cancels a Chinese infrastructure project until China reduces the debt, others are witnessing that and doing the same. And the result is that China is accepting a renegotiation of terms to make the debt more sustainable. In Pakistan, citizens and the media are on high alert about any Chinese mercantile plans to extract their precious minerals and sell it back to them as finished goods. Instead, they're demanding that China open its markets reciprocally instead. The result? China's trade surplus with members of the Belt and Road has been shrinking towards nearly zero. In Kazakhstan and elsewhere, locals are protesting that too many Chinese workers are coming in to build infrastructure projects. The result? A lot more local hiring and training of local workers. When a Chinese road project entered a disputed border region with India and Bhutan, the Doklam Plateau, the Indian army stood up, and it was China, actually, that backed down. The lesson? Regional militaries are building their capacity and cooperating among themselves to protect their territory. Just a few years ago, it was feared that the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank was another kind of Chinese plot. Today, it actually has very strong cooperation with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which, as I mentioned before, has a long history of modernization programs in Central Asia. So what do all of these examples teach us? First, again, reciprocity is how we condition members of international society. It is exactly what Europe has done very well. It should not be a new lesson for anyone here. And just as socialization has evolved and advanced in Europe, it can as well in Asia. The second, of course, is that there is no inevitability to Chinese dominance, neither globally, nor in Eurasia, nor even in Asia itself. Geopolitics is a highly non-linear discipline. Even the smallest countries have agency. Asia, after all, is made up largely of post-colonial societies. Many of the elderly people alive today still across Asia remember very well the last colonialism. I know my parents certainly do. So they will not let themselves be subjected to another one so soon. And you have to help them. Therefore, the corollary to competitive connectivity is institutional competition. And it can be done in partnerships such as what you have signed today, with like-minded states such as Japan, together promoting quality infrastructure and standards. Greater European, Japanese, even American involvement in infrastructure finance will bring down lending rates for countries to ensure concessional terms and higher quality projects. But you also have to engage politically to support the rule of law and democratic institutions, another strength to which we look primarily to Europe for today. Now remember one thing, Asia has more people living in democracies than the rest of the planet Earth. So when you look at Asia, you again must not simply see China. Japan, of course, being a foremost example of a leading Asian democracy. And there are 2 billion other people in Asia who live in democracies. They may not meet Europeans' standards of democracy, but providing technical assistance is what it will take to help them get there. The bottom line is that Europe, again, cannot view itself as merely an appendage of Eurasia when it should really see itself as a natural leader. The shift in global gravity towards an Asian world or a Eurasian world means not only the centrality of Asia and Europe in world affairs, but it also signifies something much deeper and historical, which is the return of what historians actually call Afro-Eurasia, the multi-directional commercial system of the pre-colonial world, the 15th and 16th centuries, that linked Europe, Africa, and Asia together. This is not a future prognosis. This is today. This is today's world in terms of the reality, the most significant flows of people and goods in the world. Historically, this was the moment right before Europe set out and broke through with colonial ambitions. And for 500 years, Europe has been the world's most connected region, both internally and externally. There's no reason why that should change, though in the future, of course, it's going to be a much more balanced world order. Which brings me to my final points. We have entered a truly unique phase of history, one that is permanently multi-regional, multi-civilizational, and multipolar. Never have we had such a geopolitical landscape in world history. And it is not a hegemonic system. It is not a monopoly. What it is a marketplace. Regions compete with each other. Countries compete with each other to provide services, security, infrastructure, energy, finance, technology, governance. The competition is not to dominate. It's to be the most trusted provider of these essential utilities. And again, what is the role of Europe in this? It is European living standards, welfare states, and environmental sustainability to which billions of people aspire. It is European cities and urban planning that Asians would like to emulate. It is European financial regulation and internet regulation that protects consumers. Europe can expand its norms in a borderless way, not just where Europe ends. Because power in this geopolitical marketplace, power in a connected world, is not merely a function of geographic size, military size, or economic size. It's a function of your degree of connectivity. And in the 21st century, it will be the most connected powers that will prevail. We are here on the eve of Brexit, so perhaps we could take a moment to realize that history does, in fact, punish countries that opt out of connectivity. You don't have forever to correct missteps before history passes you by. That has not been Europe's mistake on the whole, fortunately. In my view, Europe is still clearly in a very privileged position to shape the global future. It will depend, of course, on the Commission, on the Union, adopting and executing a strategy that is bold and purposeful. The choice is yours. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.